I want to apologize because a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about as far as specific examples are from the field that I'm interested in, history, and so these may not apply exactly one-to-one in the area of biblical studies or theology, but I think that the things we talk about will get you thinking, and then you can talk to your professors about these issues, more specifically about theology and biblical studies. But hopefully these examples will at least get you thinking about the issues that we're going to talk about today. Now, when we think about information literacy, I'd like to first define our term, and this is the definition that I'm going to go by. Information literacy is the ability to recognize the extent and nature of an information need. And so, what information do you need for a particular project, for a particular paper? Then to locate it, evaluate, and effectively use the needed information. And I've got in bold evaluate today because that's mainly what I'm going to be talking about. I'm not going to be getting into a lot about how to find the information or how to use it today. We just don't have enough time. But I'd like to talk about how to evaluate sources, how to evaluate information that you find, because obviously there's a lot of information out there. It's easily accessible. But how do you evaluate it? And then maybe a little bit about locating it as well. Now, as we think about evaluation, I'd like to talk about the problem for just a second. This is a Virginia elementary school textbook. It's entitled Our Virginia, Past and Present. I went to elementary school in Virginia. Virginia is really big in elementary school about hammering Virginia. Virginia history, Virginia geography, it's all about the state in elementary school. And this is a textbook for 4th graders that I believe began being used in 2010. It may have been last year, 2011, but I believe it was 2010 when it was published, and maybe first put into use in the fall of that year. And immediately there were some issues about this textbook. And but one of the main issues was that when it came to a discussion about the Civil War, there was a statement made that thousands of slaves, thousands of African Americans participated voluntarily, basically, in the Confederate Army. And so many historians saw that and questioned it and began to look at the author's credentials. And what they found was that the author was not a historian at all. And when they began to communicate with her about where she had gotten her information, why she had made the claim that thousands of slaves participated voluntarily in the Confederate Army, she said basically that Virginia required a discussion of the participation of blacks in the Civil War. And so in order to fulfill that requirement, she did a quick internet search. And she found 3 websites that claimed that thousands of blacks participated on the South side in the Civil War. And that was her documentation, that was the information she found, and then she included it in the textbook. Now we can already see the problem, right? What were these websites? Who was writing these? There's the problem of someone who's not trained in history, writing history for elementary students. And what they found, and when they looked at the 3 websites that she used, they traced all 3 of them back to a group from Columbia, Tennessee, the Sons of the Confederate Veterans. Now there's a problem here, because the Sons of Confederate Veterans in Columbia, Tennessee don't believe slavery was the main cause of the Civil War. They dispute that. Well, that's accepted generally among historians, that slavery was the key cause of the Civil War, but they deny it. And so they would have a vested interest, wouldn't they, in claiming that slaves voluntarily fought for the South in the Civil War, because that helps them undermine the idea that slavery was the major issue. But she ran with that. Well, they sent out labels to put over the disputed paragraph, but you know, you still got a problem, because this book is still being used in Virginia schools. A history book written by a person who has not studied history and is using the internet for much of her information. That's example number 1. Example number 2, and I'm sorry, I've got the clip Add title here. Let me get rid of that. Is this book. This is, and it's not just a problem about those that aren't trained in history, writing history, but there's this book, The Roots of the Reformation. This was recently published by InterVarsity Press, a well-respected Christian publisher in regard to theology and history and such, and it was written by G.R. Evans. Now, G.R. Evans she is a professor of medieval theology at Cambridge, well-respected in her field, but there was a blog article written after this book was published, and basically it listed multiple instances of factual errors. Dates were wrong, confusing different people, claiming somebody was at an event when they had already passed away. And so on that one blog article, InterVarsity Press pulled this book. And so it goes to show you that even if you have a book that's published by a respected publisher, even if it's written by an expert in the field, you have issues of credibility and issues relating to information literacy that are important. And the third example I'd like to use, and I don't know again how well you can see this, but this is a book entitled The Jefferson Lies by David Barton. It was published, I think, this past year by Thomas Nelson. And they recently have pulled The Jefferson Lies, and it is no longer being shipped as well. And the reason? Selective quotations, misrepresentation of the facts, seemingly having an agenda. And what basically David Barton did in this book is he presented Jefferson in a way that evangelical Christians would really love him. That he was just the consummate, conventional evangelical Christian. That he was a civil rights pioneer and all of this stuff. Well, he owned hundreds of slaves, right? So it would be hard to call him a civil rights pioneer. Although you would say that a person that owned slaves that would talk about liberty the way he did was pretty impressive. Civil rights pioneer? Probably not. And the idea that he was a conventional Christian is not accepted generally. And so Barton had an agenda that he wanted to promote, and he claimed it was history. And when people complained, when people objected, when people gave differing views, then Thomas Nelson felt like they had to pull this book. But how many people bought this book thinking it's an authoritative discussion about Jefferson and how, historiography has been skewed and historians have lied about Jefferson, and he was really more like us. He was a Christian just like us. And so those are three examples that happened recently about books being pulled or edited because of problems. Now, when we think about information literacy, I would encourage you to think credibility, not truth. Now, when I say think credibility and not truth, and let me pull this up to a full slide, and then the issue of being able to see it won't be a problem. Think credibility, not truth. Now, this is not going to be as easy for you guys because you're in biblical studies, and you're going to obviously think of the Bible differently than you would just any book you pull off the shelf. And we expect that and we encourage that. But I think even in biblical studies, this idea is important. Think credibility, not truth. For instance, there may be a debate about, say, who the letter to the Galatians was to. And you may have a legitimate, trained theologian, credible author make this claim, and you may have another one make another claim, and you have this debate going on, right? And so you need to think credibility, not truth. It's not that necessarily we can determine with absolute certainty and with absolute truth an answer to that question. And so there's a debate going on. And so you have a couple of things when you think about credibility that you need to consider. First of all, it's the idea of peer review. The nice thing about when you look at, say, an academic publisher, or when you look at an academic journal, is this process of peer review. And hopefully a peer review process will solve and alleviate some of the problems that we've already discussed before they actually get into print. You see, the review process should have already recognized there was a problem in that Virginia textbook, making the claim that thousands of blacks served in the South during the Civil War. Certainly, the peer review process should have picked up on the factual errors in the book on the Reformation by Evans. But the point is that this helps the process, because what it does is it doesn't guarantee it, but it gives you a little more sense of, was the research done correctly? And so what happens in the peer review process, and a lot of times it's a double blind process where, let's say I've written a book and I've got I want a book, present a book for publication. So I've got a manuscript and I submit it to a publisher. Well, they're going to send it out to reviewers. And hopefully what they do is they get rid of any indication of that I'm the author, because they don't want, if a reviewer knows me and doesn't like my work, they don't want that person to be biased against it, or if they're my second cousin, they don't want it to be published because they're my second cousin. And so you remove any indication of who I am, and I don't necessarily know who the reviewers are. And so that process helps with credibility. It assures that research is done correctly. It assures that the findings of a work are credible. Not necessarily true, because there might be room for debate. But are they credible? And do you correctly attribute prior research? Are you misquoting prior research, or are you saying this was found here when it was really found somewhere else? And this process helps that. And as I mentioned, don't confuse reliability or credibility with absolute truth, because scholars can differ from one another on the same subject. And what happens is you have maybe several plausible positions, and there's a debate going on. And you as a researcher, you as a reader, you as a student, you as a consumer have the opportunity to read both sides, and you get to come to your own conclusion about which one makes more sense to you, which one makes more sense based on the evidence. And so you really want this process, this debate process going on. And so don't think that, so in the case of history, that I need to find the truth of what really happened. You see, because that's the mistake that people make. And maybe that's the mistake people make in regard to these debatable items in theology as well. But in history, you know, sometimes people ask me, you know, were your history teachers revisionist, or were they conservative? You know, you get that question a lot. And depending on how in-depth I want the discussion to go, will make a difference how I answer the question. But you know what? Every historian is a revisionist historian. If he or she wasn't, there wouldn't be anything to write or research. You see, because we can't go back and know with absolute certainty what really happened in most cases. We can't recreate the past with 100% accuracy. It's impossible. And so we're constantly revising what we think happened, what we think was important. And so that's why you have hundreds and hundreds of books written on different subjects. That's why you want to really pay attention to what's been written lately versus what was written 200 years ago, as far as historiography is concerned. And it's probably the same way with theology. But the point is that you need to think not absolute truth in most cases in an academic study, whether it's history or theology or anything else, in the social sciences especially. But think reliability, think credibility. Has it gone through a peer review process? Have different people and experts looked at it? Is it credible? Does it use sources correctly? Those are the kind of things that you want to think about as far as information literacy are concerned. So you look at David Barton's book, and he's going to present it as absolute truth. You see, I'm going to correct all the lies and give you absolute truth. Well, you already know you've got a problem, because you're not looking for absolute truth, you're looking for credibility. And then on the side of credibility, he's got a problem, doesn't he? Because he quotes out of context, because he seemingly has an agenda, and those kind of things. And so, credibility, not truth in information literacy. Now, second, you can judge a book by its cover. Now, I want you all to participate with me for just a minute. Now I want you to look at this book. This is a book written by Glenn Beck, and this is not a political discussion, so don't get mad at me if you're a big Glenn Beck fan. But this is just an example, okay? All right? All right, I want y'all to look at this book, and I want y'all to tell me, what do you see? What are the first things that jump out at you looking at this book?
Statue of
Anything.
George Washington.
Okay, you got a bust of George Washington in the back. That's interesting. Okay. Why might that be interesting?
You should be in George.
Okay, it's talking about being George Washington. Well, that's the title's interesting, isn't it? It's not George Washington. It's what? Being George Washington. Well, that's interesting. Okay. All right. What else?
How about the smirk on his face?
Okay. All right. The smirk on his face. That's typical Glenn Beck, I guess. All right. So let's talk about Glenn Beck for just a minute. What do you notice about him on the cover? Who's prominent?
Glenn Beck.
Glenn Beck is prominent, right? Not George Washington. He's in the background. Glenn Beck, the author, is front and center. Is that interesting? Is that something to pay attention to when you're looking at a book? Should it be about the subject matter, or should it be about the author?
The author might be the subject matter.
The author might be the subject matter. Exactly. All those things you can tell from looking at the cover. So can you judge a book by its cover? You can. Now, let me read something to you from the preface, or actually author's note of this book. He says, "My name is Glenn Beck, and I am George Washington." So you already know it's not about George Washington necessarily, it's about Glenn Beck. All right? "I am the leader of men. I am fearless. I am the person others will aspire to be for generations. I am the indispensable man. I am also nothing special. I am average, I am flawed, I am fallible, I am emotional, I am awkward, and I am way too fond of ice cream." Right now in a cafe that a corporation is designed specifically to look independent of corporate influence, a blogger is typically typing furiously. He or she is sipping briskly from an 8-ounce can of lightly carbonated energy drink in an effort to stay awake for just a few more minutes to complete work on their newly discovered but soon-to-be mega controversy of the day. Glenn Beck thinks he's George Washington. He has a Washington complex. He's actually named his book Being George Washington. His ego is out of control. He must be threatening to start a revolution. I knew the Tea Party was dangerous. The news of my self-elevation to national fatherhood will likely spread from blog to blog, then to news sources and pundits, all of whom will be more than happy to spread the news that Glenn Beck's messianic complex can no longer be contained. None of them, of course, will take the time to realize the irony of the situation. They are literally judging a book by its cover. Well, we already said, you can, can't you? Glenn Beck says, you're judging the book by its cover. Now, why did Mercury Radio Arts, whatever that is, that's who published this book, why did Mercury Radio Arts spend the money and go through this? Is this a nice looking cover?
Sure.
It's a good looking cover. I like it. It's going to get people's attention, isn't it? Why did they go through all the trouble of creating this cover if they didn't want you to pay attention to it? They do, don't you? Don't they? But Glenn Beck says, we want you to pay attention to it, but not really. He goes on, he says, so what's the truth? Simple. I do believe I'm George Washington, but I believe that you are too. I don't believe this because I'm an extraordinary high opinion of myself. I believe it because I have a real understanding of who George Washington was. Okay, so now you know what he's saying, right? He's not saying, me personally, Glenn Beck, am the reincarnation of George Washington. He's saying, we all can be George Washington. Basically, the characteristics and character and decision-making ability and leadership ability that George Washington exhibited, we can do that too. Now, did you hear anything else that stands out to you in that reading? He says at the bottom, he says, I believe it because I have a real understanding of who George Washington is. That jumped out to me. What does that imply?
That he has an agenda.
He's the greatest historian.
Yeah, he's the one he's the standard, right? So I shouldn't go to books by great historians published by academic presses to learn about George Washington. I should go to Glenn Beck, right? And in fact, if you read the inside of the dust jacket, this is what he says. He says, this is the amazing true story, see, of a real-life superhero who wore no cape and possessed no special powers, yet changed the world forever. He talks about how through these stories you'll not only learn our real history, and how it applies to today, you'll also see how the media and others have distorted our view of it. You see what he's doing? He's saying, there are all these distortions out there about George Washington, and I'm going to tell you the real story. But you learned all that by looking at the cover, didn't you? You didn't need me to read all that stuff. You knew that's what he was trying to do, didn't you? Now, he very well may have some insight. Who knows? But I do know one thing, and that is that the idea that our founding fathers or any historical figure were somehow superhuman can't be correct. They are flesh and blood human beings just like us. And he does say that. He does say George Washington was flawed. But you build these people up, number one, probably to inappropriate levels. Number two, the idea that their problems are the same as our problems and all we have to do is recreate them, that kind of thing, that's not history. Okay? Alright? That's something different. That's political. But he's presenting it as history. Okay? And also, you look at the publisher, right? When you look at a book. Okay? So, Mercury Radio Arts. What do we know about that publisher? Well, we don't know, but it's certainly not an academic publisher, is it? It's not one sponsored by a university, and so you've got questions there. So that's keep that in mind. You can judge a book by its cover, and I meant to get a good example. But these academic books that your professors order and that Jamie does so well to acquire for us, what do they normally look like? Do they look like that? Do they have the author's photo on the front? No. What do they look like? They're plain. A lot of them don't have dust jackets, right? And if they do, Jamie's probably going to take them off anyway. But they look brown. They're brown and they're green, and they just have the title, and they don't look attractive at all, do they? They're not going to be something you see at Books A Million. Okay? They're not going to be something that you can pick up at Marsville Bookstore. What does that tell you? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, number one, if it doesn't look attractive, it actually might be something positive for that book. Okay? An academic book is not necessarily going to look attractive. So if it's ugly, you might want to pay attention to it. If it looks like this, you might want to be suspect. Okay? So you can judge a book by its cover. Let's talk about packaging in general. Get beyond the cover. I want to talk about what the guts of the book. Okay? So you've picked up your book. You've picked up Glenn Beck. You like this attractive cover and you picked it up. Or you've picked up some ugly brown book that Jamie just said was available in the library. Now what do when you open it up? Well, the first thing that you look for is, are references properly documented? Are there footnotes? Are there endnotes? Are there parenthetical citations? Is there some way to figure out, okay, who is this person using for his research or her research? And if I wanted to go look that stuff up myself, where could I find it? Okay? Alright, so that takes us to our second book, and I'm not even sure where that thing is. Here it is. Alright. Okay, and again, not a political statement, so don't get mad at me if you like Bill O'Reilly. Alright, so we've got a second book that was recently published. Killing Lincoln by Bill O'Reilly and Martin Duggar. Okay? Alright, so this is the shocking assassination that changed America forever. And this is presented as history, right? Okay? Alright? Now, the first thing that I look for are footnotes or endnotes. Has anybody read this book? You know what I find when I look for footnotes and endnotes in this book?
No.
Take a wild guess. Not a single one, right? Okay? So is that a problem?
Yeah.
If I want to find a history book on the assassination of Lincoln, I'm not going to use as my first choice one that has no footnotes or endnotes to figure out what are their references. Okay? Now, they do have a section on notes at the end. And I want to read that just briefly to you. And it won't take very long, believe me. They write, from a research standpoint, the events before, during, and after the Lincoln assassination were ideal. The many articles and eyewitness accounts were laden with an astounding amount of information. The following list of books, websites, and other archived information reflects the main research sources for this book. It bears mentioning that visits to Sailor's Creek, Battlefield, High Bridge, Appomattox Courthouse, Ford's Theater, and the various historical sites, along with John Wilkes Booth's escape route, will add immeasurably to the reader's understanding of all that came to pass in April 1865. And then it lists in, the book is divided into parts, and it lists various sources that they got their information from. What jumps out to you in that paragraph I just read to you? What are they telling you? They're telling you, we've looked at all these sources, right? Believe us, it's true. Okay? And this is what we've used. We promise we looked at them. They don't tell you where they looked at them. They don't tell you where you could find them. They don't tell you what part, what sentence was quoted from this source. They just tell you, we did. And they want you to take that at face value and believe it. Okay, so if Wayne says, I want you to write a short paper in his Western Civ B course, or World History B course, which I don't think he would, but if he said, I want you to write a paper on the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, what are you going to do with this book? You're not going to use it, are you? Okay? Because the packaging tells you it's not academic. Okay? It might be entertaining. It might have some interesting tidbits in it, but it's not an academic book. In fact, historians will tell you that, that basically what they're doing is they're rehashing old ideas about the assassination, many of them that have been discredited for many years. All right, so does it have an extensive bibliography? If you pick up an academic book, what are you going to expect to find in the back? A two-page essay on our sources? No. Page after page after page after page of bibliographic information, so that if I, as a student, a researcher, a scholar, want to look at this further, I can, right? I can't really do that with this book. All right? As we've already mentioned, is it published by an academic press? In other words, does a university sponsor it? Now, you guys help me out, faculty. Religious, biblical studies, theology, name some top university presses. I mean, obviously you got Oxford, you got Cambridge. What else you got? I found out one when we were moving the library all around. Nathan was, that jumped out at me, was South Carolina, I think it was. They have a religious, they do religious stuff. That I didn't know.
Pennsylvania has had material, and then you also have some German universities that are published.
See, these guys know that stuff. You need to ask them. What are good publishers in regard to biblical studies, theology, religion? And that can focus where you go in the sources that you use. It may be a professional association. The Society of Biblical Literature might publish a book. If SBL publishes a book, Ed, is that a good place to start on a subject? Good place to start, okay? And there may be commercial enterprises that specialize in academic material. Think of one for me for theology, if anybody. A commercial publisher that focuses on academic stuff. Anybody got one off the top of your head?
You've got Baker Publishing,
okay.
Zondervan, several of those.
All right.
They're not into the deep, the heavier scholarship, but
depending on who wrote it and what the audience was, might be a good option. Okay.
Beginnings.
Good. All right. Let's see. And then very quickly, do they rely primarily on textual presentation? What do I mean by that?
Not pictures.
Yeah. Not pictures. Okay. All right. So don't look for your latest picture book and use it in your classes, right? You want words. Okay. Not a lot of illustrations. Not a lot of pictures. Words. Okay. And does it have a formal style or academic tone? Okay. Now, when I say, I am George Washington, and you are too, is that an academic tone? No. It might be a fascinating book. You might learn a lot. It might be a book you can really flip through and be entertained by, but it doesn't have an academic tone, does it? And we can all recognize that. So packaging is important. Now, let me very quickly, how much time do I have?
Negative 5 minutes.
5 minutes, all right. Let me very quickly. Negative 5 or 5?
Negative 5.
Oh, brother. Okay. Never mind. Okay? All right. This is how I do internet research. Now, sometimes you might want to do internet research where you want to see not what books and journals they're out there. For that, use Discovery through our website. Maybe you want to know are there websites that have good information. And great way to do that is just get on Google and you want to type something up, right? And you want to say, okay, I want to know about Winston Churchill and World War II. So you type Winston Churchill plus World War II, and then you type site, and then a colon, and then edu. Okay? Alright, so, and then you hit enter, and everything that comes out is going to be from a .edu website. Does it mean that it's always going to be accurate? Does it always mean it's going to be good information? Does it always mean it's going to be up to date? No, but what you've done is you've narrowed your options down, haven't you? And if you want to look at what's available in the United Kingdom, you do ac.ac.uk, that same kind of search. And if I had time, I would do it for you, but if you type in Winston Churchill, World War II, and do this, you find some great stuff. Fordham University has some great stuff on primary source material that you'll find like 3 down on a Google search by doing that on Winston Churchill. Same thing with the ac.uk information. Now, information can be out of date, information can be distorted or biased, information can be untrue, information can be commercial, information can be just some guy behind a computer typing out some stuff. And so you all need to pay attention to what you're finding on internet research. So ask, who wrote it? Who is this written for? Is the material biased? Am I trying to convince you of something, or am I just trying to present information? Does the author belong to an organization with an interest in presenting only one side of the case? Go back to the Sons of Confederate Veterans idea. And what's the date of the information? And then very quickly, pay attention to quotations. Here's a quotation I saw finding its way through the interwebs and Facebooks and MySpaces and all that recently. The budget should be balanced, the treasury should be refilled, public debt should be reduced, the arrogance of officialdom should be tempered and controlled, and the assistance to foreign lands should be curtailed, lest Rome become bankrupt. People must again learn to work instead of living on public assistance. And then the credit is given to Cicero and the date 55 BC. What's the problem with that quote?
Was it Cicero a lot later than 55 BC?
Yeah, the dating's probably okay. The dating's probably okay. What might be the other issue?
It was very precise to what he said.
Okay. One thing that jumps out to me is it sounds so modern, doesn't it? It sounds like it fits issues that we're complaining about today, doesn't it? Well, this probably came from a novel about Cicero that was published in the 1970s. That's basically what we can put together where this quote came from. And so the important point here is that whenever you have a quote that sounds like it fits our modern issues, you might want to check that, okay? And so very quickly you could figure out, okay, does this quote fit? Remind me, am I getting BC and AD mixed up, Eric, on Cicero? I'm thinking that 55 is good. But my guess is you probably don't have anything that early or late, depending on how you want to look at it, as far as extant, existing documentation of stuff that Cicero wrote. So you can very quickly type that into the internet and figure out, hey, there's really no reason to believe this is a correct quote. Now the problem is that some people don't care. And they'll say, I don't care. It makes sense to me. And I don't really care. But the point is that they're using Cicero as a way of giving the quote credibility. And we really don't need to use false information that way.